There is a specific kind of quiet that falls over a house when you realize something is wrong. Not the ordinary silence of sleep, but a silence that has weight, that presses against the walls and makes the air taste different. I noticed it on a Tuesday in March, standing in our kitchen at 11:40 at night, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't drunk, listening to my wife's car pull out of our driveway for the second time that week after she'd already told me goodnight. My name is Daniel. I'm 41 years old. I teach high school history at Lakeview Prep, and I've been doing that for 14 years because I genuinely believe that understanding the past is the only way to make honest decisions in the present. There is some irony in that, in retrospect. Claire and I had been married for 11 years. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party in the city. She was laughing at something her friend said, and the sound of it cut right through the noise of the room and found me across a crowded apartment. We were married within 2 years. We bought a house in the suburbs. We had a daughter, Maya, who was 8 years old and obsessed with horses and the idea of building her own telescope. We had a good life. I was certain of that. The things I didn't know could fill a room. That Tuesday in March, I told myself Claire had gone back to the pharmacy. She'd mentioned earlier that she needed allergy medication and had forgotten to pick it up. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the kind of explanation you accept without examining it too closely, because examining it closely would mean asking yourself why your wife is leaving the house at nearly midnight for allergy medication when there's a 24-hour store 2 minutes away and she'd been out all afternoon. I set the coffee down on the counter. I went to bed. She was back by 12:15. I listened to the sounds of her moving through the house, water running, a drawer closing, the familiar creak of the third floorboard in the hallway. And I pretended to be asleep. And I told myself that pretending to be asleep was the reasonable thing to do, that it would all make sense in the morning. The morning came, and it didn't make sense. But I smiled across the breakfast table at my wife and helped my daughter find her left shoe and drove to school and lectured 32 teenagers about the causes of the First World War. I was very good at staying in the present moment. It was a skill I'd been developing without realizing it for longer than I could honestly say. I want to tell you I knew right away that there was some lightning bolt clarity the moment something shifted in our marriage. But that's not how it works. It works slowly, like water finding cracks in stone, patient, invisible, accumulative. You don't see the damage until the structure begins to move. The damage had been accumulating for months. I just hadn't been looking at it squarely. Not until the night I found the receipt in the pocket of Claire's winter coat. Looking back, I can identify the month the atmosphere in our house changed. November. Early November, right after the clocks went back and the evenings turned dark by 5 o'clock. Something contracted in Claire. Not dramatically. There was no shouting, no coldness, no obvious withdrawal. It was subtler than that. It was the way she began to hold her phone face down on the kitchen counter when she cooked dinner. It was the way she started angling the screen away when she texted, a habit she'd never had. It was the way she laughed differently on the phone in the other room. Lighter, younger, almost girlish, in a way that I found myself noticing and then immediately filing away as nothing. Our marriage was not in crisis. That's what I would have told you in November. We argued occasionally, as all couples do, about money, mostly, and about the amount of time I spent on school work in the evenings, and once, memorably, about whether to repaint the living room a color called vintage linen that looked indistinguishable from the existing white to me and apparently represented a fundamental personal transformation to Claire. We were fine. We were normal. We were in that phase of marriage that doesn't get discussed because it's too ordinary to be interesting. The phase where you love someone deeply and also occasionally cannot remember the last time you had an uninterrupted conversation. Claire worked as a project manager for a mid-size architecture firm downtown. She was good at her job, precise, calm under pressure, unusually skilled at managing complicated personalities. Her work had intensified over the past year. Her firm had taken on a significant urban development contract, and she was one of the leads. She worked longer hours. She traveled occasionally for site visits. None of this was strange. None of this would have been strange to anyone on the outside looking in. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, not just filed away, was a name. Marcus. She mentioned him in late November, casually, the way you mention a colleague. He was the lead architect on her project, she said. Brilliant. Notoriously difficult to work with, but brilliant. She said this over dinner, and I asked a few polite questions, and she answered them, and we moved on to other things. but the name sat in my memory differently than other names sat. I didn't know why. I couldn't have justified it. In December, I heard her laugh that way on the phone again. In the hallway, door half closed, while I was putting Maya to bed. The same lightness, the same register. When she came back into the bedroom, she said it was her colleague Priya calling about a project deadline. She set her phone down on the nightstand, face up, and I saw the screen was already dark. She hadn't ended the call. She'd already ended it before she came back in. I noticed. I said nothing. I read 3 pages of my book and understood none of them. Maya, that winter, began having what we called her observation phase, a period when she would sit very still at the dinner table and watch us with the focused attention of a scientist monitoring a developing experiment. She was 8, and intensely perceptive in the way that some children are. The way that feels almost uncanny until you understand that children simply notice everything and haven't yet learned to pretend otherwise. She asked me once, in January, while I was helping her with homework at the kitchen table, whether Mommy was sad. I told her Mommy was tired. Maya considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence and then returned to her math worksheet. I sat very still for a moment after that, and the kitchen was very quiet. February brought the first overnight trip. Claire's firm was visiting a project site 4 hours away. She'd be gone Thursday evening through Saturday afternoon. She packed a small bag, kissed Maya and me goodbye, and drove off in the early evening. I tracked the trip in the way you track these things when you're telling yourself you're not tracking anything, by noticing when she texted, whether she called, how long the calls lasted. She texted when she arrived Thursday. She called briefly Friday morning. She was home Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, slightly windburned from what she described as a windy outdoor walkthrough. I had no reason not to believe this. I didn't quite believe it. I couldn't have said why. It was in February also that I first met Priya, at a work function of Claire's that I attended, a low-key drinks event at a downtown bar. Priya was warm, direct, funny in a dry way. She asked me what I thought of Claire's latest project. I said I didn't know much about the details. Priya looked at me with an expression that lasted less than a second, a flicker of something I couldn't name, and then smiled and said Claire was very dedicated. The evening moved on, but I held that flicker of expression somewhere in the back of my mind. The way you hold a coin you found on the street that you think might be valuable and might be nothing. I should tell you about Marcus. I'd never met him. I'd only heard Claire mention him twice, in November, and then once in January, in passing. But in February, she stopped mentioning him at all. And the absence of a name you have reason to expect, in retrospect, is louder than the name itself. March arrived with rain and a quality of restlessness I couldn't quite account for. I'd started paying attention in a way I hadn't given myself permission to call paying attention. I told myself I was just being more present, more observant. It was what I taught. The importance of reading primary sources carefully, looking at what's there and what's conspicuously absent. The first concrete thing, a Friday night in early March, Claire told me she was having dinner with her colleague Priya. She left at 7. I texted Priya at 8:15, asking her to pass along a restaurant recommendation Claire had mentioned, a plausible reason to reach out. Priya responded within minutes. She was at home, hadn't seen Claire in over a week, hoped everything was okay. I stared at the screen. I typed back something bland. I set my phone on the table and sat in the living room while Maya slept upstairs, and I listened to the clock on the wall make its small mechanical progression through time. Claire was home by 10:30, carrying a faint smell of wine and something else, something warm and unfamiliar, a cologne or an aftershave that wasn't mine. She kissed me on the cheek and said dinner had been lovely. I told her I was glad. We watched 20 minutes of television and went to bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the coat she'd worn, a long charcoal wool coat she kept on the hook by the front door. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. Something concrete. Something I could hold in both hands and examine. The coat's outer pockets were empty. The inner pocket had a lip gloss, a folded receipt from a pharmacy, the allergy medication dated 2 weeks prior, and, tucked behind the receipt, a small cardstock parking ticket from a downtown garage on West 5th Street. The garage was 2 blocks from the hotel district. The parking ticket was time-stamped Friday at 6:48 p.m. and exit-stamped at 10:04 p.m. 3 hours and 16 minutes. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. My hands were very steady, which surprised me. I'd expected my hands to shake. I want to be honest about what I did next. because it doesn't reflect particularly well on me. I opened my laptop and I looked up the parking garage on West 5th Street. I found that it served several restaurants, an office building, and 2 hotels, a business-class chain hotel called the Arton and a smaller boutique hotel called the Meridian. I saved both names in a note on my phone under the heading Grocery List. Then I closed the laptop and went upstairs to wake Maya for her Saturday morning riding lesson, and I drove her there. And I stood at the fence watching my 8-year-old daughter learn to steer a quarter horse named Captain, and I smiled at the right moments, and nothing in my face showed what was happening underneath it. I think about that morning a lot. The way grief, or whatever the pre-grief of suspicion is, doesn't stop the world. The horses still moved. Maya still laughed. Captain still tossed his head and flicked his tail. I was still there, still a father, still a man standing in the morning light, even with this new and shapeless thing living in my chest. The red herrings began around this time, though I didn't recognize them as such. Claire mentioned, over the following 2 weeks, that Marcus had left the firm. Drama, apparently, a falling out with the senior partners over the project direction. She said this neutrally, as information, not as something with emotional weight. I felt a loosening in my chest that I immediately distrusted. People don't mention names so casually when those names carry no charge. And the mention of his departure was too clean, too convenient, like a story that had been prepared rather than lived. I also got a call from Claire's sister, Diane, in mid-March. She was checking in, she said. Had I noticed Claire seeming stressed? Diane was warm but opaque. She worded things carefully, the way someone does when they know something they've decided not to tell you. I said Claire had been working hard. Diane said yes, probably that was it. There was a pause before she said goodbye that lasted 2 beats too long. The night of the second late departure, the one that would later frame everything. Claire told me at 9:30 that she'd forgotten her laptop at work and needed to pick it up before an early morning call. She was gone for 90 minutes. I sat in the kitchen, and I didn't move, and I was very quiet inside myself in the way that you can be when you already know the shape of something but haven't yet brought yourself to name it. I am not someone who had ever imagined himself conducting surveillance on his wife. I'd always thought, in the abstract way you think about situations that haven't happened to you yet, that I would simply ask, that I would sit down with Claire and say, something feels wrong, talk to me. I'd believed in directness. I'd built a fair amount of my identity around it. But I had already asked, in the small ways that are available to you in a marriage when you're not ready to say the large thing out loud. I'd asked how work was going. I'd asked if she was happy. I'd asked once, in February, whether we should take a weekend trip somewhere, just the 2 of us, and she'd said yes. Absolutely. That sounded wonderful, and then nothing had come of it, and I hadn't pushed. The small questions had been answered and the large one hadn't been asked, and I found myself, in the 3rd week of March, doing something I'd never expected to do. I downloaded a driving route app, and I noted what was actually near West 5th Street garage in careful detail. I also called the Meridian Hotel under the pretense of asking about an event space. In the course of the conversation, I mentioned that a colleague had recommended the hotel, and I was trying to remember his name. A man, architect type, might have stayed there recently. The woman on the phone was politely unhelpful, as she should have been. But when I mentioned, one of the rooms might have been booked under a firm name, architectural practice, downtown, she paused in a way that told me she'd recognized something, before she said she couldn't share guest information. I thanked her and hung up. Then came the discovery that shifted everything sideways. I was putting away a clean stack of sweaters in our bedroom closet, a task Claire usually handled, but she'd asked me to help that week. On the shelf above mine, in the back corner, folded inside a lightweight scarf I'd never seen her wear, was a phone. Small, older model, a basic prepaid. It was powered off. I held it for a long moment. Then I put it back exactly where I'd found it, refolded the scarf, and walked out of the closet and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Here is what I thought. Marcus had left the firm, but the phone was still here. The phone predated the story of his departure. It had to, given when I'd first noticed the behavioral shift, which meant either the story of his departure was false, or the departure was real, but the relationship had continued independently. Or, and this is where it got strange, I was wrong about Marcus entirely. The phone could belong to someone else. The phone could be for something else. The phone could be a red herring the size of a mountain. I spent 3 days in genuine uncertainty about what I actually knew. I replayed everything. The parking garage timing, the Priya alibi, the perfume that wasn't mine, the phone calls, Diane's strange pause. And alongside all of it, the fact that Claire had been, throughout this entire period, in most visible respects, a good wife and mother. Present at dinner, attentive to Maya, warm to me in the ways that didn't require her to lie directly. The cup of coffee left on my desk when I was working late, the hand on my shoulder when she passed behind me at the counter, the thousand small gestures of a shared life that don't disappear immediately even when something underneath them has shifted. Was it possible I was wrong? I held the question honestly. I'd been known to misread things. I could be anxious and prone to pattern matching. The parking ticket could be coincidence. The phone could have any number of explanations. Priya's text could have been a miscommunication. I am a history teacher. I understand that primary sources can be misleading. I understand that narrative coherence is something the human mind constructs, sometimes out of nothing. I nearly talked myself out of it. And then our daughter Maya, on a Thursday evening in late March, showed me a drawing she'd made at school. It was her family picture, she said, a project for art class. She'd drawn herself, and me, and Claire, and then, in the corner of the page, a figure she'd drawn with a gray crayon, and then, I noticed, partially erased. "Who's that?" I asked, as casually as I could manage. Maya looked at the erased figure. "Nobody," she said. "I made a mistake." And then she put the picture away in her folder before I could look at it more closely. Children don't half-erase people by accident. I waited until the following Saturday, when Claire was at the gym. I went to the closet. The scarf was still there. The phone was still inside it. I turned it on. It took 3 minutes to boot. It had 6% battery. There was one contact saved under the name L. There were 12 text messages in the thread. I read them. I turned the phone off. I put it back. I sat down on the closet floor with my back against the hanging coats, and I breathed in and out for a while. The coats smelled like cedar and Claire's perfume and the faint chemical smell of dry cleaning. I stayed there until I heard the front door open. The messages were not explicit. They were something worse than explicit. They were intimate in the way that only happens after a long time. Private references, small callbacks to shared moments, a fluency and ease that takes months to build. They were the messages of two people who knew each other very well and were in no hurry. And the name wasn't Marcus. The name, from the signature of two messages, was Leo. I didn't know anyone named Leo. I spent 4 days with this knowledge before I used it. 4 days of making school lunches and grading papers and asking Claire how her day was and listening to her answer. It is a strange thing to know something enormous and to hold it without showing it. Every conversation becomes a performance. Every silence becomes something you're monitoring for leaks. You become, temporarily, a person who is lying, not about the thing you've discovered, but about having discovered it. And there's a particular shame in that, even when the lying feels necessary. On the 5th day, I called Diane, Claire's sister. I told her I needed to talk to her in confidence and I needed her to be honest with me. There was a long pause. Then Diane said, "How much do you know?" Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "I'm not sure what you mean." Just, "How much do you know?" Which told me everything about the extent of Diane's involvement. She had known something for some time, and she had made a choice about it. She came to the house the following afternoon, while Claire was at work and Maya was at school. We sat in the kitchen, and Diane held her coffee cup with both hands and didn't drink it. She told me that she'd known about Leo for roughly 2 months. He wasn't an architect. He was someone Claire had reconnected with from before we'd met, an old relationship that had apparently never fully closed. Diane said she'd told Claire to end it. She said Claire had told her she would. She said she had believed her, at least for a while. She said she was sorry. I asked how she could have sat across from me all these months and said nothing. She said she'd been protecting her sister. I told her I understood that, and I meant it, and I also told her that it had not been her choice to make alone. We sat with that for a moment. Then Diane told me one more thing. Claire and Leo had not, as far as Diane knew, met before November. They'd reconnected online. The relationship had moved quickly. Leo lived in the city. He had a studio near the warehouse district. He worked in graphic design. After Diane left, I called the school and arranged for a colleague to cover my classes the following day. Then I called my closest friend, Patrick, and I told him in 10 minutes what had taken months to accumulate. Patrick said very little, in the way that good friends know how to be very little, present and quiet and not hurrying toward solutions. He came over that evening, and we sat in the backyard and drank 2 beers and didn't solve anything, and it was the most honest conversation I'd had in months. I thought about confronting Claire before I decided what I wanted to happen after. That seemed important. I'd seen, in other people's stories, how the confrontation can collapse into the immediate crisis of the moment: shouting, denial, counteraccusation, breakage, and how the larger question of what you actually want your life to look like afterward gets lost in the noise. I needed to know what I wanted before I opened that door. I spent 2 days knowing that I wanted my marriage to be the thing I'd believed it was, and knowing, simultaneously, that it wasn't and never quite would be again, and learning to hold both truths at once. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday evening in early April. Maya was sleeping over at her school friend's house. The night was cool and slightly damp, with that specific April smell of cold soil and something beginning to green. Claire had made pasta for dinner. It was still on the stove when I came downstairs from checking the closet one final time, just to be sure the phone was still there. It was. I could hear her moving in the kitchen. I could hear the particular rhythm of her, the way she moved in her own home, the gestures so familiar I could map them without looking. I sat down at the kitchen table. I waited until she turned around. I said her name. Something in my tone reached her before anything else did. I watched it happen in her face. A shift, a stillness, a bracing. I put the phone on the table between us. I didn't say anything else. I just waited. The denial lasted less than 30 seconds. Some part of her had been preparing for this, I think, had been carrying the anticipation of it for months. The denial collapsed under its own weight almost immediately. What replaced it was something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not more deception, but a kind of exhausted grief that looked very close to relief. She sat down across from me. She put her hands flat on the table. She said his name, Leo, in a voice I didn't recognize from 11 years of listening to her speak. We talked for 4 hours. I asked questions I'd been holding for months, and some of them she answered and some she couldn't. She told me it had started as something she told herself wouldn't go anywhere, that it had become something she hadn't known how to stop, that she hadn't stopped loving me. And I sat with that statement and tried to decide if it made things better or worse, and found that it did neither, that it simply sat there in the room with us, true and insufficient. She told me she'd ended it 2 weeks ago. I told her I knew she hadn't. The most recent message on the phone was 9 days old. She closed her eyes. She didn't argue. There was a moment, somewhere in the third hour, when I looked at my wife across the kitchen table. The table we'd bought at a flea market 11 years ago, the one with the slight lean to the left that we'd always meant to fix, and I felt something so complex I had no single word for it. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't love in any simple sense. It was something that grief and knowledge and shared history make together when they've been living in the same house for a long time. It was the specific pain of loving someone and no longer being able to trust what that love is built on. By midnight, we had not resolved anything except the truth. The truth was out and on the table, and we were both looking at it, and neither of us knew yet what came next. We told Maya 2 weeks later, in the careful, age-appropriate way that child psychologists recommend, and that feels, in practice, like an act of simultaneous honesty and protection that you're not sure you're performing correctly. We sat on either side of her on the living room sofa, her parents, still in the same house, still capable of sitting side by side. And we told her that Mommy and Daddy were going through some changes, that we both loved her completely, that nothing about that would ever shift. Maya listened. She looked at the drawing she'd made, the one with the erased figure in the corner, which was still on the coffee table. She asked if we were getting a divorce. We said we didn't know yet. She nodded. She seemed, in some way, unsurprised. The saddest part about children who are perceptive is that they often already know the thing you're trying to protect them from. Claire moved into a rental apartment in late April. The separation was not acrimonious. We were both too tired for acrimony, too preoccupied with making sure Maya felt anchored. We spoke every day, at first about logistics, then gradually about harder things. Claire began seeing a therapist. So did I. Mine was a calm, methodical woman named Dr. Elaine who had the useful habit of asking what I was feeling and then waiting, without discomfort, while I searched for the honest answer rather than the easy one. I learned, in therapy, that my marriage had not been as visible to me as I'd believed. Not because I was obtuse, but because I had developed, over years, a habit of prioritizing stability over clarity. When things had felt tense or off, I'd smooth them rather than examine them. I'd interpreted Claire's withdrawal as tiredness, her distance as stress, her changed behavior as the ordinary volatility of a busy life. Some of that was reasonable. Some of it was deliberate. Somewhere underneath my certainty that we were fine, I think I had been afraid that we weren't, and I'd chosen not to look directly at that fear. The question of Diane took longer to process. She and I had a second conversation in May that was harder and more honest than the first. I told her that her silence had cost me months, months of confusion, of self-doubt, of adjusting my sense of reality to accommodate a version of events that wasn't true. She told me she'd been trying to protect her sister. I told her that the protection of one person, pursued without honesty, often becomes the harm of another. We didn't fully resolve it. I'm not sure we needed to. Some things can be understood without being forgiven, and forgiveness can come later or not, and either is acceptable. The question of Leo the first handled differently than I'd expected. I had thought, before everything was in the open, that knowing who he was would make me angry in a focused and uncomplicated way. Instead, I found I had very little interest in him as a person. He was someone Claire had made choices toward. He was a detail in a story that was really about my marriage, not about him. Patrick told me this was mature. My therapist said it was also possibly a way of avoiding something. I suspect both are true. In June, Claire and I had what I can only describe as a frank accounting. Not negotiation, not reconciliation, an accounting. We looked, honestly, at what the marriage had been and what it had cost us both and what, if anything, was worth preserving or rebuilding. We sat in a park near the house, on a bench we'd sat on 100 times, and we spoke carefully and quietly and with a kind of honesty that hadn't been available to us inside the marriage, because honesty of that scale requires a certain distance from the thing you're trying to see clearly. We filed for divorce in August. It was not a violent process. The legal work was clean, and the custody arrangement for Maya was built around her needs and her schedule and her writing lessons and her homework, and it was the thing we managed best together, being her parents, which I'll admit I found simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. You can be good at one thing with someone and still know that the larger thing is finished. I am writing this from my house, the same house, though it looks different now, rearranged and partially rehung with art that is mine rather than ours. Maya is upstairs doing homework. She comes here 3 nights a week and every other weekend, and she still occasionally has her observation phase, watching me carefully from across the dinner table. But there's something different in it now, less monitoring and more simple attention, the way you look at someone you're simply glad to be around. I've thought often about what I wish I'd done differently. The list is real and I hold it honestly. I wish I had asked the harder questions earlier, when there was still time for them to matter inside the marriage rather than after it. I wish I had understood sooner that smoothing things over is not the same as taking care of them. I wish I had known that the silence between two people who once talked constantly is a primary source worth reading carefully, rather than a comfortable absence to accept. But I've also thought about what I did right. I didn't act from fury when I found out. I didn't blow everything apart before I knew what I actually wanted. I protected my daughter as well as a person can protect anyone from real things happening in the world. I stayed honest in the confrontation. I let myself be sad without letting the sadness become permanent. These things matter. They accumulate in their own way, like the other things, but towards something better. There's a question I've been asked, in various forms, by various people who know the story. Do you wish you'd found out sooner? And my honest answer is this: I don't know. The discovery changed my life in ways both painful and, strangely, necessary. I know myself more clearly now. I make eye contact with my life in a way I didn't before. I understand the difference between the story I was telling myself and the story that was actually happening, and I no longer assume those two things are the same. I teach my students that history is not about the past. It's about learning to read the evidence in front of you with clear eyes, accepting what it tells you even when what it tells you is not what you were hoping for. I've always believed that. I understand it now in a different way than I did before. That has to count for something. This story unfolds along a specific psychological pattern, a man who has made rationalization into a form of loyalty. Daniel doesn't ignore the signs of his wife's infidelity out of stupidity or naivety. He ignores them because looking directly at them would require dismantling a version of his life he has carefully maintained. His coping mechanism, smoothing over tension, reinterpreting inconsistency as fatigue or stress, is not a character flaw so much as a deeply embedded survival strategy. Over 11 years, it became invisible to him. He had learned to stay comfortable inside uncertainty by never fully inhabiting it. This is the psychological core of the story, not Claire's betrayal, but Daniel's pre-existing architecture of willful optimism. He is, as he himself eventually admits, a man who knew how to be present without looking closely. His professional identity, a teacher who insists that honest reading of evidence is fundamental, creates a painful irony that the story handles with restraint. The gap between what Daniel teaches and how he lived inside his marriage is the story's quiet moral center. Claire's behavior is psychologically coherent in its own way. The second phone, the Priya alibi, the partial truth about Marcus as cover for Leo. These are not the actions of a careless person. They're the actions of someone managing two lives in parallel and doing so with enough skill to sustain it for months. But her exhaustion in the confrontation scene, the near relief when the denial collapses, suggests that the effort of maintenance had become unbearable. She was carrying the weight of the deception in a way that was taking its own toll, even as she kept building the architecture of it. The role of Diane complicates the story's emotional landscape significantly. Her decision to protect Claire, sustained across months, functions as a secondary betrayal, not romantic, but interpersonal. Daniel's observation that the protection of one person, pursued without honesty, often becomes the harm of another, is one of the story's most important lines. Diane believed she was choosing loyalty to her sister. What she was actually doing was extending the timeline of Daniel's confusion and self-doubt. This is how webs of silence operate in families. Everyone believes their silence is kindness, and collectively, it becomes damage. Maya's presence throughout the story operates as a moral compass that the adults have difficulty accessing directly. Her observation phase, her erased figure, her quiet acceptance of the news when it finally comes. All of these register a child's awareness that something was wrong long before the adults could name it. Children frequently perceive emotional reality at the level of atmosphere rather than language. Maya knew. She just didn't have the framework to say what she knew, and so she drew a figure and then partially erased it, which is a more honest document of her experience than almost anything the adults produced during this period. The question of red herrings, Marcus, the overnight trip framing, the pharmacy story, points to something important about how betrayal sustains itself. None of these were random. Claire constructed them with enough plausibility to survive casual examination, and Daniel accepted them with enough willingness that no examination was ever anything more than casual. The relationship between liar and deceived is not always a simple power dynamic. Sometimes it's a mutual arrangement, one that neither party could name at the time, to keep the surface undisturbed. What separates Daniel's response from many similar situations is his decision to know what he wanted before he opened the confrontation. This slows the narrative and costs him additional time and discomfort, but it prevents the conversation from collapsing into crisis management. He enters the confrontation with grief already in progress, which paradoxically allows him to remain present and ask real questions, rather than simply reacting. That composure is not coldness. It's the product of having already done the hardest emotional work before the conversation began. What accumulates in this story is not a single catastrophic failure, but the compounding effect of small decisions made in avoidance. The question not asked, the discomfort smoothed over, the feeling filed away. Daniel and Claire both contributed to the architecture of their marriage's collapse, though not equivalently and not in the same way. Claire made choices that were dishonest. Daniel made choices that were comfortable. Neither set of choices was sustainable. And the tragedy is not that the marriage ended. It is that both people could have seen this coming far earlier and chose, each in their own way, not to look. The story's emotional resolution rests not on recovery in the romantic sense, but on the harder work of clarity. Daniel does not emerge as someone for whom everything is fine. He emerges as someone who finally lives inside the truth of his own life rather than the story he'd been telling himself about it. That shift, from a man who manages reality to one who sees it plainly, is the real arc of the story. And it is, as he puts it, something that has to count for something. Not everything, but something real.